Welcome. Today's video will cover how to implement the annual general adjustment and how to apply banking in a rent-controlled unit. This presentation is organized by a series of questions that a landlord must be able to answer in order to implement a rent increase in a rent-controlled unit. The first question a landlord needs to be able to answer is a unit a rent-controlled unit? The Richmond Rent Ordinance creates rent control. Rent control regulates and defines the amount of any rent increase. The Rent Ordinance defines controlled units as all residential rental units in the city of Richmond, with several exemptions. The most significant exemptions are the following: rental units which are owned, operated, or managed using government subsidies, including low-income housing units and Section 8 units. Exemptions created by Costa-Hawkins, which includes new construction, defined as permitted structures built after 1995, and single units on a single parcel. Please note that unpermitted ADUs and in-law units create those properties to be multi-unit properties, and so they may fall under rent control. If you are uncertain if rent control applies to your unit, please contact the rent program. Before a landlord can implement a rent increase, the property must be compliant with rent ordinance regulations. Otherwise, the rent increase may be invalidated. So a landlord must ask, is the landlord compliant with all rent ordinance regulations? Compliance generally means four things. First, a landlord must enroll with the rent program. Enrolling is the process in which a landlord informs the rent program of their business address and all their rental properties. Enrollment can be completed on the City of Richmond's records website. Second, once enrolled, the rent program will mail the landlord an invoice. Compliance means that all fees for any period that the unit was a rental are paid. Fees are a flat rate and are due if at any period in the fiscal term the unit is a rental. Fees do transfer through property sales. Third, landlords must register all rent-controlled tenancies. The rent program provides a tenancy registration form for the landlord to disclose the tenant names, tenancy start dates, and rent. This information is critical to accurately calculating legal rent increases. Finally, a landlord must have a business license and complete any required inspections. These are run by different departments and have their own associated fees. A good place to start is the city's Measure You business tax website. Once compliance is confirmed and a landlord is ready to take the annual rent increase, the next thing needed to know is, what is the annual general adjustment and how may a landlord bank deferred AGAs? The annual general adjustment, known as the AGA, is the landlord's entitlement to an annual cost of living rent increase. The amount is a percentage of the tenant's rent. The percentage rate was established by Measure P and is either 3% or 60% of the Consumer Price Index, whichever is less. Any untaken or deferred rent increase is owed to the landlord and is termed the landlord's bank. This year, the annual general adjustment is 1.62% and becomes effective on September 1, 2025. Next, in order to calculate a rent increase, a landlord must know what are the base rent and the maximum allowed rent. The base rent is the rent established on July 21, 2015, or the rent at the start of the tenancy if after July 21, 2015. It can often be found in the lease, and generally is the rent collected for the first month. The base rent is required to be disclosed to the rent program on the tenancy registration form. The maximum allowed rent is the application of every allowed AGA to the base rent. This is the rent ceiling. The landlord may never collect more than the maximum allowed rent. Now that you understand what a rent increase is, the next question to be able to answer is, when is a landlord allowed to start applying the annual general adjustment to a new tenancy? The annual general adjustment only applies to tenancies that, on September 1st, have existed more than a full year. For example, if the tenancy started in October 2025, the AGA for September 2026 would not be permitted because the tenancy would have not existed one full year on September 1, 2026. In this example, the first allowed AGA would be on September 1, 2027. You now have enough information to ask, how is a rent increase calculated? Before you can calculate a rent increase, you must have the tenancy start date and the base rent. In this example, the start date is October 10, 2016, and the base rent is $1,000. The rent program provides a calculator to do all the math for you. The calculator is located on our website under the Rent Increase tab. Next, you will determine what is the first allowed annual general adjustment. In this example, because the tenancy started before September 1st, 2017, the first allowed rent increase will be the 2018 AGA. To use the form, you simply place the base rent in the appropriate yellow box and press Enter. The form will automatically apply and compound all the annual general adjustments and calculate the maximum allowed rent. The maximum allowed rent is in red at the bottom of the page. As a reminder, this is the rent ceiling. The landlord may never collect more than the maximum allowed rent. Knowing the maximum allowed rent, you can then proceed to the next page and calculate the actual rent increase. You start using the second page by filling in the current rent and pressing Enter. In this example, the current rent is $1,075. Once you press Enter, the form will automatically calculate the percentage of bank available to the landlord. The final step is to enter the percentage by which the landlord wants to increase the rent. When entering this percentage, the landlord must understand an important rule. In 1 year, the landlord may only take the current year's AGA and up to 5% of available bank. If the bank is over 5%, the landlord may not apply the entire bank at once, but rather over the course of several years of rent increases. In this example, the current annual adjustment is 1.4%, and the landlord elects to take 5% of available bank. The landlord enters 6.4% in the box, indicating the percentage of rent increase. Once pressing Enter, the form automatically generates the dollar amount of the rent increase, the new rent, and the percentage of bank that remains for the following years. If there is no bank or if the landlord elects not to apply banking, then simply put the current year's AGA into the box and calculate the rent increase and new rent. Once you have completed calculating the rent increase, the next question to answer is, how does a landlord give notice of a rent increase? Giving notice is a two-step process. Step 1 is to give a notice to the tenant. Step 2 is to give a copy with proof of service to the rent program. The rent program provides a copy of a rent increase notice and proof of service on our website. On the rent increase form, the landlord is simply filling in the name of the tenant, the address of the unit, the dollar amount of the rent increase, and the dollar amount of the new rent. The landlord must also set the date the rent increase becomes effective. The effective date must be at least 30 days from delivery of the notice. Please note that in some rare instances, such as when a landlord is awarded a rent increase through a petition, the effective date may need to be 90 days from delivery of the notice. Notices may be delivered personally, by handing them to the tenant, or by mail. Please note that if you mail the notice, you must add 5 additional days to the timing to allow for mail delivery. After you deliver the notice, the deliverer fills out and signs proof of service. Proof of service is sworn testimony that the deliverer performed his duty. In cases of personal service, the deliverer must put the name of the person he handed the notice to. And when mailing it, the deliverer must write the address information. The second step of giving notice of rent increase is to give a copy of the notice and proof of service to the rent program. From date of delivery, the law gives a window of 10 business days to provide the rent program a copy. The rent program accepts copies through our online uploading portal. Email is not accepted. For properties of 5 or fewer units, a hard copy may be mailed to our offices. The online portal can be found on our website directly below the rent increase forms. The portal asks you to fill out basic information, such as the tenant's name and the amount of the rent increase, and upload a copy of the notice and the proof of service. This concludes our presentation. Thank you for taking the time to learn about how to undertake a legal rent increase under the Richmond Rent Ordinance. If you have more questions, feel free to schedule an appointment.